Yo, so guys, welcome back to another video. This is another Wendover Productions reaction, and this one is why public transportation sucks in the US. And I remember, I don't know if it was when it was when I did a video. I think I've in a few videos in the past actually. Public transport in the US has been sort of a topic for discussion, and basically just talking about how it's terrible in the US. And it kind of surprised me because I would have thought like places like the US, Japan, like China, would have like first world country but rich countries. So obviously the UK's transport here isn't actually great, to be honest. Always cancellations and delays, but I mean it's alright. I mean I don't really travel like that, so I've not really got the best sort of perspective on that. But yeah, I know the US, from what people said in the comments, it's actually terrible in the US, and from what I've seen in videos as well. And it's just sort of surprised me because again I thought just countries like that would just, especially the big countries. I thought the bigger the country, sort of the more efficient you try and make your trains and your buses and all these different things. But obviously that isn't the case with the US, for example. And I'm interested in seeing why, basically. I mean, I guess it's to do with maybe the money's not pumped into it and just stuff like that, but I don't really know why like it was stuck in the US. We're going to find out in this video. Hopefully you guys are going to enjoy. This wasn't necessarily suggested, but it was like a topic that has been brought up on the channel a lot, again, like I said. So I mean, I just thought just see it and just see why it actually is the case. But hopefully you guys are going to enjoy. Links to my Instagram, my Twitter in the description. Same for my second channel. Links are all there. And I mean, yeah, if you want to follow me on those socials or subscribe to my second channel, close to 15k, I'd really appreciate that. But let's get into this video and see what this is about.
This video was made possible by Skillshare. Learn anything, including
Getting
how
his
I
money,
make these
my guy.
videos, for free for 2 months by going to skl.sh/Wendover. This
always
is Indiana,
Skillshare.
and this
Always.
is Scotland. Both have a similar number of inhabitants, a similar size, and a similar population density. But here's Indiana's public transportation system, and here's Scotland's. You want to...
So is this, when it says this, is this just for trains? I mean, that is crazy when you think about it. Because the Highlands in Scotland as well, like the mountains around this region are crazy. But when you consider that's the difference, that is wild. Like you'd probably, like say you're like coming from here, you'd have to travel here. Then if you want to get someone there that's like here, you have to go like up there. Or maybe somewhere that's like here, you'd have to like get a bus or whatever. I'm assuming this is trains, by the way. I mean, I get maybe it's not. Maybe it's just routes for all sort of transport, but we'll see.
get to Cooper, a town of 9,030 miles from the capital. That'll take you 55 minutes on a train that leaves every 30 minutes or an hour and 40 minutes on a bus that leaves every 40. You want to get to Anderson, a town of 50,030 miles from Indiana's capital? Well, you're out of luck. The only option is the car. Antiquated
Really?
technology, safety concerns, crumbling infrastructure, and non-existence, it's not hard to argue that the US public transportation network is just not good. Vast swaths of the US have
wow.
no option but to drive because the alternative just is not there. This has consequences on the environment, on economic mobility, on where people live. The consequences of America's lack of solid public transportation almost defines American culture. But it wasn't always like this. The United States once had the best public transportation system in the world.
So they optionally chose to just not. See, that's crazy. I would have thought maybe they just never sort of put it in place, and maybe now they're just kind of like, it's going to cost too much to have railways to these smaller towns and stuff. But with what he's saying here, there was a point where they had the best. How does a country that's that rich and that sort of like just well off, I guess you could say, wealthy, in so many areas, forget about one of the most important things for its like own people, like transport to different cities, different towns? Maybe not cities, but a town of 53,000 people doesn't have a railroad, or doesn't have like trains there at all, like no trains for transport, like to get into other places. That's crazy to me. That's absolutely insane. Because I swear, like literally every small town in the UK or in England, for example, as he said Scotland, but in England, you get it through like towns with like what 2,000, 3,000, maybe not 2,000, maybe like 5,000 people, and it just sort of goes through to another place. But I guess maybe again it's easier because the cost of this would be crazy. But that is kind of surprising to me.
It was the admiration of countries
very surprising,
worldwide
not
and an
kinda.
essential factor allowing for the successful Western expansion of the country. It all started with this, the horse car. Now, there were urban transportation systems before these horse-drawn trams came along, but they weren't cheap and they weren't fast. Roads generally weren't paved, and there just wasn't the economic demand for high-frequency service because these carriages were rarely faster than walking. But on rails, these horse cars were fast, and one horse could pull a full load of passengers thanks to the rails. In its heyday, there were over 6,000 miles of horse car lines in the US. In comparison, the combined mileage of every tram, subway, light rail, and commuter rail system in the US nowadays is 5,416. In 1880, 50 million people lived in the US. Today, over 320 million. Around the turn of the century, many of those horse car systems were electrified. There were then 11,000 miles of streetcar track nationwide. The systems were absolutely everywhere. Even tiny towns like Bangor, Maine and Berlin, New Hampshire had streetcars. So what happened? How did the US go from having 11,000 miles of streetcar to 200? How did the US go from having solid public transportation in towns big and small across the country to how it is today? The decline of the streetcar began just after the turn of the century. That was when the automobile came around. By 1920, the car was starting to get to an attainable price point for the everyday individual. That was the real threat for the streetcar. Not cars, but economical cars. The streetcar received another blow in 1929, the Great Depression. There were fewer people with jobs, which meant fewer people who needed to commute and fewer people who had the money to pay for transport. So many lines were just not profitable anymore and closed. But then the streetcar received a stay of execution.
It's so weird how like you've got, this is sort of like when you see all eras coming together. You've got like trams here, you've got horses like here, people riding horses, and you've got these old school, like old ass cars, and cars, and you've got people walking on the road. It just seems like absolute mayhem. But this is all sort of like, not cultures, but all sort of eras coming together, and this is sort of where certain things like people riding horses in just on the street like it is their car like nowadays probably stopped around this kind of time, and cars took real sort of control. But it's just crazy how you see in this picture like all different eras together. I'm surprised there's not like a tricycle here somewhere.
Closed. But then the streetcar received a stay of execution. World War II. You see, during World War II, the US had the lowest unemployment rate in history, as low as 1.2%. There were tons of factory jobs to support the war, so practically everyone who wanted a job had a job. That meant that there were tons more people now going to and from work, and even better for the streetcar, there were rations going on rubber and gas, which diminished the popularity of the car. But something else was going on through all that. Something more sinister. Sometime in the 1920s, automobile technology became advanced enough that the bus became cheaper to operate than the streetcar. Streetcars cost very little to power, but they do require a lot of infrastructure from overhead lines to track. Buses were more flexible and required almost no infrastructure, and the bus had some powerful friends, the automobile companies. Or more specifically, General Motors. General Motors went and bought dozens of small streetcar companies across the nation and turned them into bus companies. They removed hundreds of miles of track across the US and supported other companies doing the same.
Really?
But it's not like they didn't have a good reason to do this. These streetcars were not economically advantageous. Buses were faster, cheaper, and at the time, they were the modern and fresh transportation method that the public wanted. Nearly every streetcar system nationwide was replaced with a bus system. In addition, the streetcar companies were almost all commercial, so if and when they failed, many local governments set up public, subsidized bus companies. So that's how transportation got bad, but why did it stay bad? Well, mostly because of the car. America is the country of the car. It grew up as the car grew up, so its cities were built for cars. Think Dallas, Phoenix, Los Angeles. You can't survive in these cities without a car. Remember, the United States is centered around the idea of personal freedom. With a car, you can go anywhere at any time. So politically, cars have historically been associated with the idea of personal freedom. Just like the Republican Party votes to have strong national defense, allow gun ownership, and preserve small government in order to promote personal freedom, they have always worked to promote the usage and ownership of cars. That means they often voted in favor of subsidies helping the auto industry, most often in the form of indirect subsidies lowering the cost of gas. Now,
really? That is surprising. I wouldn't have thought like a political party would be sort of like in any country. I didn't really like think they'd factor in like helping out car companies as opposed to like other sort of transportation or transport like ways of transport like trains, because I mean, at this point I don't even know what to say because it's just kind of crazy. But I can't get the idea of a town of 53,000 or over 50,000, what exactly the figure was. I can't remember the full figure, but That's like 1/4 of the size of the city that I'm from now. And the city I'm from now is a relatively small city in the UK, but there's that would be considered a big town, or probably maybe in some places a small city in the UK, like whether it had is it a cathedral to be considered a city in the UK? Well, it's just like stuff like that, and it would just be crazy if a place that big wouldn't have any sort of like train like tracks going through it, or like a railroad, should I say, or like buses. I mean, I guess these places have buses and stuff, but like to get to these places in the first place, it's just like I can't get over that. You've literally got to drive so damn far, and people must just be stuck in those sort of towns, like without really being able to travel anywhere else. Like, I'm actually so surprised by
Now,
that.
that was fine when cities were small, highways were new, gas was cheap, and climate change wasn't even a concept, but that's not the case anymore.
Yeah.
Cities are just of a size where they literally cannot support their entire population driving. You can't fit more road infrastructure in many cities, but you can fit more public transportation. Cars were available to the common American much earlier than the common European, so the US set road policies early that allowed for large, smooth, and well-functioning roads. While the US was building its magnificent roads, Europe was building their public transportation systems. The high car usage in the US even has to do with zoning. You see, European cities tend to have less strict zoning laws which allow for businesses and housing to intermingle.
It is actually crazy how the difference in even like the cities is just wild. Like how they sort of the formation of the cities, like the roads and stuff. You can literally see it
The
there
US
as well.
zones its cities much more strictly. Houses are next to houses and businesses are next to businesses, which means that the distance between houses and shops in the US is much greater. Therefore, Americans have to go further more often. The most demonstrative fact is how the two places approach parking. In the US, zoning laws specify a minimum number of parking spaces per building. In Europe, the laws specify a maximum number of parking spaces. The
Really?
three cities with the three
have
lowest
a-
car ownership rates in the US all have something in common. Boston, New York, and DC are all old, rather compact cities with decent public transportation systems. Since they were cities before the car, they're built much more like the European cities that have such good public transportation systems today. Simplified, public transportation gets worse as you go further west.
I know, like California in particular, Los Angeles, the traffic there. All I ever hear is how terrible it is. Like I've not actually seen. I've probably seen pictures here and there, but I've never actually looked into it. But I always just hear, especially like Joe Rogan. He always talks about like the LA traffic is just horrible beyond belief. And to be fair, like in cities like London, for example, the traffic there is terrible, and that's the thing you're going to get with these big cities. But I guess there's a level of how bad it can actually be. And like going to London for me would be considered bad, but maybe in the US that would just sort of be the average sort of city, maybe kind of thing.
Since Western cities are newer. But here's the most important sentence of this entire video. Access to transportation is the single most important factor in an individual's ability to escape poverty. That is not a subjective claim,
It's
that is
true.
a fact that emerged from a Harvard study. Someone who lives right by a subway stop is astronomically more likely to find a high-paying job than someone who doesn't have a way to get around.
That is such a good point. Sorry for pausing it again, but I know like a lot of people from the city I'm from. The city's like 2 and a bit hours away from London on train, and a lot of the people, and this isn't just from like the city I'm from, cities all around sort of maybe 2-3 hours away from London, maybe a bit closer. A lot of the people who live in these cities have to travel on like transport, like trains and stuff, to get to London to work. So obviously they use the transport to get to their job. So it does help a lot of people in those cities to get work in like the major city. But obviously if you have like, you don't have transport like this in big towns or small cities, they don't even have the ability for that. So he makes actually a very good point, because that sort of sparked me remembering how it is like when like people like rush hour in London, like people rush hour to get to the city that I'm from. It's just like rush hour. I feel like I'm just rambling at that point, but like I can just see where he's coming from. Like people from my city having to travel 2 hours, people from the US would have to travel 2 hours, but instead they can't do that because there's no ability to do that. And I guess they could drive, but it's just, it would be a lot easier kind of thing, and it would be quicker as well.
Individuals in poverty generally
Very much
live in
quicker.
poor neighborhoods with few job opportunities. But with reliable, accessible, and inexpensive public transportation, these individuals can get all across their city to where the jobs are. So, a good way to evaluate the effectiveness of a public transportation system is by how well it serves the poor. DC, for example, does a good job of this. The poorest neighborhoods have the greatest proportion of their residents within a 10-minute walk of a metro station, while the richest neighborhoods have the smallest proportion. Hand in hand with their move back into the cities, millennials are shunning cars. Car ownership among young people is at historic lows, and the urban youth is relying more and more on public transport. Some cities like Portland, Kansas City, Detroit, and DC are turning back to streetcars. Done right, streetcars can drive huge increases in economic development. They're more of a symbol of modernization that entices residents, developers, and businesses to areas. Portland, for example, has had an estimated $5 billion in extra economic development thanks to its streetcar. New streetcar systems are being built all across the US in cities like Milwaukee and Oklahoma City since they're finally making money again. Not from their fares, but from the jobs brought by their existence. People didn't want them a century ago, but streetcars finally make sense again. Public transportation is instrumentally important to the success of cities. You can almost be sure that a good city will have good public transportation and a bad city will have bad public transportation. Public transportation increases economic mobility, decreases carbon footprints, and increases economic development. So the only question is, why not build more of it? One of the most common requests I receive is for a behind-the-scenes video. And
interesting video, man, honestly. I do like this kind of sort of these just kind of videos that sort of show views and opinions from stuff that I wouldn't have really known about before, and especially with this sort of subject. It's crazy how this is the case, but it does make you realise for sure, especially in a country like the US, man. And then you have the Japanese rail system that posts federal apologies for a single train that showed up 6 seconds late. I live in Los Angeles, and the first question I got asked in the job interview is, do you have a car to commute to work? See, I've not even learned to drive yet. I've not even considered it. I've not considered learning to drive because I don't have the urge to do it. I mean, I don't really travel anyway, but there is always like a sort of need to drive somewhat, and I do understand that. But at the same time, I just don't sort of let my sort of feelings evolve around it. You realise how bad the situation is when your car breaks down. When you're too sick, disabled, or old to drive in the USA, you'll end up being in a nursing home. You might have even called this video Design Named Streetcars. When anyone not from Scotland talks about Scotland and is being nice, it warms my soul. Boston, New York. I'm not going to stop doing that because and DC have decent public transport systems. Chicago, I'm going to joke to you. But what I noticed about that is these are all cities on the sort of the east side kind of. Remember Chicago, not necessarily, but it's the more eastern side than the west side kind of thing. And all these cities are that, especially Boston and New York and DC. But it's interesting, honestly. I would take the bus or train if there were some. In the UK, house prices go up whenever a railway gets a new or bigger station. I didn't even know that. I didn't actually know that at all. Oh wow, I did not recognise that at all. That's crazy then. Maybe I should... Nah, maybe not. But I hope you guys enjoyed this reaction. More of these on the way. I love Wendover Productions. I find these videos so fun to watch and just learn about. But what are your thoughts on this? I initially thought this would sort of touch upon just like how trains are always late and just all these different things, like they're just really bad at scheduling, which is probably also the case. But I didn't realise it was going to be like certain routes just wouldn't be possible to get to, certain places just wouldn't be possible to get to. I didn't even acknowledge that. I'm just surprised that a place like the US has that, but I guess maybe it's a mix of being left behind and sort of focusing on like cars and stuff, as well as the cost, because the US is so big it will cost so much more. But still, it is a surprise to me. But I hope you guys enjoyed this reaction. More of the stuff on the way. Let me know in the description what you want to see, in the comments should I say. But until next time, like, subscribe. Peace.